Hey guys, today we're taking a look at the ontological argument presented by Dr. William Lane Craig. I'll let their video explain what that is, but if you haven't heard of it before, be prepared for the worst.
In the year 1078, a monk named Anselm of Canterbury astonished the world by arguing that if it is even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist. Anselm's argument came to be called the ontological argument, and it has sharply divided philosophers ever since. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called it a charming joke, but many prominent 20th century philosophers such as Charles Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, and Alvin Plantinga think that it's sound.
Okay, so 3 random 20th century philosophers think it's sound. Good for them. But someone who's regarded as smart thinking an idea is good doesn't mean that it is, and you should never agree with something just because some philosopher does.
Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being. If something were greater than God, then that being would be God. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world.
A maximally great being would be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. Why? Who's deciding on this criteria? Sure, maybe in the eyes of some humans this would make a being maximally great, but outside of some humans, in the context of the whole of the universe, what does great even mean? Saying something is great is a description based on the opinions of humans. Something being maximally great or maximally weak only makes sense when comparing its attributes against what humans value. The only other sources for the criteria I could think of would be that the maximally great being itself or somehow the universe decides what it means to be maximally great. But that doesn't really work, because if the maximally great being decides what it means to be maximally great, then who cares? That would be like me saying I'm maximally great because I am what I am. Would that make me actually maximally great? No, it would just make me an asshole. And if they were to say it's the universe, they would have to establish that the universe can think, or that there are rules carved into the fabric of the universe to describe what it means to be maximally great, which they can't do. So then I guess it's people who decide what it means to be maximally great? But according to Christianity, God decides what is and isn't objectively moral. So far, not making a lot of sense. If we are saying the maximally great being has to be maximally great in all possible worlds, it is possible that there is a world where causing harm is considered morally good, because people or whatever lives there enjoy being harmed. If different possible worlds have wildly different views on morality, then the only way for this maximally great being to be morally perfect in all of them is to say that said maximally great being decides what is objectively moral in each possible world, meaning that the maximally great being is only perfectly moral because they perfectly follow their own morals, which means that the reasoning is circular. To reiterate, the only way for a being to be maximally great in all possible worlds is for that being to ignore whatever is going on in any of the possible worlds and decide what it means to be maximally great themselves, which, as I said earlier, is stupid. By that logic, any being could declare themselves maximally great, and because people have subjective opinions on what makes a being maximally great, I remain unconvinced that a truly maximally great being is even possible. And if we are considering all possible worlds, that just adds more subjective opinions on what it means to be maximally great on top of all the subjective opinions in this world. As I hinted at earlier, the argument also assumes that there is objective morality in the world/universe whatever, which they haven't even proven to be the case. And in the Christian worldview, which is the view of the people making this argument, God decides what is objectively moral. Therefore, the maximally great being is only maximally great because said being describes what it means to be maximally great and fits its own criteria, at least in the case of being perfectly moral. As I explained, just because the being says it's maximally great doesn't mean it is, and it doesn't mean anyone else should care. This is not an intuitively coherent concept. In fact, it's contradictory for the being to be maximally great in every possible world unless they can prove that objective morality exists, which of course they can't, and they need to justify that all-powerful and all-knowing criteria are somehow the final, unchanging criteria of a maximally great being. However, the people making this video don't attempt to establish that the being itself decided on these criteria, even though they think the maximally great being, God, is the one who decides what is and isn't objectively moral, and the whole argument goes against a cornerstone of their religion, but I digress. They end up implying man makes the criteria. But that would mean it is subjective, meaning there is no such thing as a truly maximally great being because there are multiple different opinions on what makes a being maximally great. So this maximally great being isn't an intuitively coherent idea. Okay, so the whole idea of a maximally great being is debunked. Video over, right? Well, it could be over here, but I think it would be fun to see what else they have to say.
Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have. So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist.
No, we couldn't say that they exist in a possible world because we have no reason to think that possible worlds or universes or whatever they're trying to refer to actually exist on any level other than our imagination in this context. We aren't talking about the possibilities of what planets we have observed are like. We're talking about theoretical worlds where we can imagine anything that isn't an oxymoron, like a merry bachelor. Nothing exists in a possible world. We can imagine worlds that never happened, but they only exist in our heads as abstract ideas. So, more accurately, we can imagine unicorns in the fantasy world. They don't exist in a possible world. And it might sound like I'm nitpicking on this, but just see what they try to do with this concept.
So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait, a maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. That is, a maximally great being actually exists.
Okay. The flying spaghetti monster can be defined as a maximally great being. It is also possible that the flying spaghetti monster exists in a possible world. If it is a maximally great being, it has to exist in all possible worlds. If it exists in all possible worlds, it exists in the actual world. Therefore, this flying spaghetti monster actually exists. See, I can define things into existence with your logic too. Are you still going to stick with your ontological argument if it means you have to live in a world with a maximally great flying spaghetti monster? You started this argument by saying God can be defined as a maximally great being. And if something were greater than God, that would be God, with no justification. So I am defining my flying spaghetti monster as the most maximally great being, meaning that the flying spaghetti monster is now God, according to your logic, and if the flying spaghetti monster is now God, then the Christian God isn't. Therefore, Christianity is debunked by your logic. Flying spaghetti monster is now our God.
Thus, the atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists.
No, just because you can imagine what a maximally great being might be, and then say that it's possible, and then say if it's possible a maximally great being exists in a possible world, it exists in all possible worlds, and therefore the actual world doesn't mean it actually exists. Everything that you've done so far is create a headcanon for the universe. You have not established that this being in any possible way exists except in your head. By your logic, anything you can imagine with the properties you ascribe for it to be maximally great therefore exists in the actual world and is therefore God. There is no evidence that the universe functions like this whatsoever. This is just completely pulled out of a philosopher's ass because they were coping about the lack of evidence for God. Atheists don't have to maintain anything as a result of this argument because nothing establishes that the universe follows any of the rules this argument assumes. If there is evidence the universe does follow those rules, they didn't bring it up. The only justification that a maximally great being is even possible is that it can be imagined, and it isn't an obvious oxymoron. Please spare me the BS.
Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial. But what about point number 1?
First of all, I hope I made it very clear that steps 2 through 6 are definitely controversial. It takes you from a maximally great being exists in some possible world, someone's imagination, to therefore it exists in the actual world. Because if it is a maximally great being, it has to exist in all possible worlds, otherwise it wouldn't be maximally great. They don't establish any of their assumptions about how the universe works as fact, so actually no, 2 through 6 are absolutely controversial. Now, because we already established it doesn't seem possible so far for a truly maximally great being to exist because they didn't really give us a straight answer on where the criteria comes from, and the only sources I could think of didn't pan out from what I could see. Let's see what they have to say about it. Let's see what their justification is for why a maximally great being is even possible.
Clearly, if it can be shown that the idea of a god is logically incoherent, then the argument fails. But is the idea of a maximally great being absurd, like a married bachelor, or a square circle, or the smell of blue? This doesn't seem to be the case. The notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being that exists in every possible world seems to be a perfectly coherent idea.
Really? Really? That's it? You don't have anything else to say about it? You just implied that was the controversial step out of like 6 controversial steps. And all you have to say to justify it is that it seems like a perfectly coherent idea? That is nothing. You would have just been better off leaving your reasoning nebulous, but instead, you just show your cards that basically say, yeah, it seems like a good idea. That's it. That's literally it. That's all they have to say about it. I don't know what I expected. It's not like there's really anything better to justify these ideas. I mean, like I tried to think it through. Nothing panned out, so I don't know why I expected it to be better than this. This is bad.
But couldn't we parody this argument and make it work for anything? Why not say, it's logically possible that a maximally great pizza exists. Therefore, a maximally great pizza does exist? However, the idea of a maximally great pizza is not like the idea of a maximally great being. In the first place, there aren't intrinsic maximal values that make pizzas great. There could always be one more pepperoni to increase its greatness. It's not even obvious what properties make a pizza great. Thin crust or thick crust, extra cheese, anchovies? It's relative to the taste of the consumer. In the second place, a maximally great pizza would have to exist in every logical possible world. But that would mean that it couldn't be eaten. So it wouldn't really be a pizza, because a pizza is something you can eat. The idea of a maximally great pizza turns out not to be a coherent idea. The idea of God, on the other hand, is an intuitively coherent idea. Therefore, his existence is a possibility. And the ontological argument shows that if God possibly exists, then God actually exists.
If the notion of a maximally great pizza isn't coherent because what makes it maximally great is subjective to people and it can be eaten, then the notion of a maximally great being isn't coherent either. Here, they finally imply the criteria to describe what makes a being maximally great comes from man, by saying what makes a pizza maximally great is relative to the consumer. So, maximally great is subjective. A being cannot actually be maximally great. You didn't get criteria from God or the universe, or at least if you did, you haven't established that. The criteria are the subjective ideas of a man that require lots of assumptions about the universe you haven't established to be true. On top of that, beans can be eaten. Beans are eaten all the time. the pepperonis and anchovies on that pizza are either beans or come from beans. So for the same reasons that the maximally great pizza is incoherent, a maximally great bean is also incoherent, meaning that it is not possible according to this logic. So according to the ontological argument, if it's not possible, it doesn't exist. Wow. That was a roller coaster of stupidity. Hopefully you didn't lose too many brain cells watching this. If you care to lose a few more, join me next time.